Excellent. Good boy. Yeah, we call him Leo because he's got huge paws, like a lion. You say hello? Okay. Is your cat's name? Excellent. Leo's going to talk about Moby Dick today, right? Okay. You comfy? I don't think I can do this lecture with you on my lap, though, Leo. Good morning. Yeah, this is Leo. You think I can? I don't know. We'll see. Okay. This is our special guest. We'll give it a try. Leo is concerned. He has concerns. Oh, this isn't going to work. I'm not going to have both hands. Okay, come on, Leo. Oh. Down you go. I know. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Leo's just too big to have on my lap at the same time as I'm talking. All right. Sorry if you have PTSD about Moby Dick, but I want to talk about rethinking Jackson's bank war. I want to talk about Jackson's second term. And I'm not usually a big fan of presidential history, and I'm not really especially a fan of Andrew Jackson, but it's important to kind of understand the conflicts in Jackson's period, to understand a bunch of things that are happening with slavery and with capitalism and with what the central tensions of the 1830s are, and I think ultimately how slavery is going to end. So let me talk a little bit about the bank war. And to do that, we can start with Moby Dick. So this is an actor. To talk about Moby Dick, we had to begin with the ocean. And we have to begin on ships because the drama of Captain Ahab's quest is the story of two conflicts. The conflict between the men on the ship and the greater conflict between the ship and the whale. The whale, of course, has the advantage. Time and tide will flow, Melville tells us, and the hated whale has the round, watery world to swim in, as the small goldfish has its glassy globe. Xbox commercial. Apologies for that. He has no pedigree. No, Leo has no pedigree at all. He is an American brown dog, so we picked him up at the pound. That's Moby Dick. Now, when Moby Dick was written, Herman Melville sent a draft of the chapter to his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a writer, kind of famous writer at this time. And we have the record of a letter. Hawthorne explained to Melville how his story was an allegory, that is, a story with a hidden meaning. And we don't actually have that letter from Hawthorne, which I think was very conscious on the part of people in Melville's estate, because an allegory is a story with a hidden meaning, and there's a hidden meaning in Moby Dick. And Melville understood that there was an allegory in the story, but he actually didn't himself understand what the allegory was. But as you see here, he says, I had some vague idea while writing it, he told Sophia Hawthorne. The whole book was susceptible of an allegorical construction, and also that parts of it were. But the speciality of many of the particular subordinate allegories, that's Melville, were first revealed to me after reading Mr. Hawthorne's letter, which intimated the part and parcel allegoricalness of the whole. So Hawthorne figured out what Moby Dick was really about. Sent Melville a letter. Melville was astonished that he was able to figure out this thing. And the letter is lost to us. Allegoricalness, right? And so I don't know if Moby Dick is one of those books that lots and lots of people in English have been analyzing for years. There are all these PhDs in English who never finished their dissertation, trying to figure out what Moby Dick was an allegory for, precisely what was going on. But the people who've analyzed the allegory, try to analyze the allegory of Moby Dick, haven't really been historians. And I wasn't really especially interested in Moby Dick at first. But as I was finishing writing this book about the history of financial panics and sort of thinking about the U.S. survey and how all this stuff fits together, right? You had to have somebody else tell you what the book is about. I kind of figured out what the white whale is about and what this kind of conflict in Moby Dick represents. So can somebody give us a quick rundown of Moby Dick? What's the plot, if there is a plot? Sorry for those of you that have PTSD about this. We want the classic comics version of what happened in Moby Dick. Okay, man wants whale, whale kills man. So you have this guy, a sailor, call me Ishmael, who gets on a ship run by Captain Ahab, and Captain Ahab and his ship are devoted to killing this white whale that is attacked Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab tried to kill him before. The whale basically tore off his leg, and Captain Ahab has this peg leg, and he's devoted everyone on the ship to destroying the white whale. And at the end of the book, the whale kills basically everyone on the ship. Including perhaps the narrator. It's not entirely clear. Is that fair? Other parts of the Moby Dick that you'd like to recall? For those of you that have PTSD, it's beautifully written. It's beautifully written, and the obsession that Ahab has with killing the whale is interesting. And Melville has this really interesting way of kind of using old Shakespearean language and stuff like that. It's parts of the book are incredibly boring. It's a really long book, but parts of the book are really, really beautifully written. And there's a kind of a relationship between this Ishmael and Queequeg, who's a sort of Native American person who's also hunting the whale, and the relationship with the crew is part of the story, and they're all simultaneously obsessed with destroying the whale, but also their interaction is kind of interesting. Okay, so that's Moby Dick. That's sort of the shortest Moby Dick version that I can give you. And now I want to talk a little bit about Jackson's Bank War, because Moby Dick is a story about Jackson's war against the Bank of the United States. Okay, so let's go back to this image that you've seen before. After the Panic of 1819, remember, Nicholas Biddle and kind of helps set up this new network for lending that goes all the way across the Atlantic. Britain, in particular, is sitting on a lot of capital, a lot of cash, and there are a lot of people with bank accounts that want to earn more than, say, 2% on the money that they have that's lying relatively unused, and so they put their deposits in these rural joint stock banks, along with the Manchester and Liverpool banks. So these are banks that are sort of on the edge of Britain, and those banks are making money by trading what are called Lombard Street bills. And the Lombard Street bills, I won't go into the details of it, but the Lombard Street bills are being issued by this group called the Seven Houses. The Seven Houses are in turn using sterling bills of exchange, which they're then issuing as long-term credits, 6-month credits or 9-month credits. And the people who are using these 6-month credits at about 6%, 5 to 6%, are the Second Bank of the United States and the agency banks. And the agency banks then are issuing banknotes, and the banks are effectively lending for land and enslaved people, and particularly in the South. So there's this sort of complicated chain of debt where the interest rate goes to as much as 15 to 25% in the United States. But through these various agencies, Second Bank of the United States, the Seven Houses, and then these banks in the north of England, we see people investing their deposits, putting their money in deposits, which are eventually used to fund the transfer of cotton back across the Atlantic, which is allowing enslavers to buy more slaves. Does that make sense? We talked about this before. So it's basically a credit chain that goes across the Atlantic Ocean. Does that make sense? And the Second Bank of the United States is involved. That's with Nicholas Biddle. But there are also these agency banks that are involved. And they're sort of in competition with each other. Each of them are trying to get sterling bills of exchange. Each of them are issuing state bank notes and silver notes and Dixies. And at the same time, the banks are providing credit to enslavers in the South. And so what I said before is that after the Panic of 1819, what we see is much more rapid expansion into the Southwest, South Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. That's the West in the 1820s, and an internal slave trade. That this is basically funded by this complicated process. Right? Does that make sense? And so what comes of this? So this is I said that the South was called Dixieland, and this is why it's called Dixieland. These notes that are issued by these agency banks, particularly the ones in French Louisiana, have the word Dix on the back, and the places where these banknotes are current, where they act as currency, is in the South, in Mississippi and Louisiana, and that's called Dixieland. Steamboat operators call that area Dixieland, and it eventually comes to represent the South generally. Okay. So that's the world as it exists after, say, the 1820 or so, all the way through the 1830s. But Nicholas Biddle has a plan. And Nicholas Biddle's plan is to close out the other banks, those agency banks that are competing with him for those sterling bills of exchange. So what he wants to do, he has this kind of method, as he sees it. He's going to establish the branches on the East Coast, and he's also going to establish branches in the UK, and he's going to trade in these Lombard Street bills directly, bypassing the older method of using these sterling bills of exchange. So what he's going to try to do is to take Lombard Street bills, pay them off at say 5 or 6%, and then use them directly in the United States as bank drafts. He's going to compete against Southern banks, drive them out of business, and have a kind of monopoly over this trade. If he does this successfully, he is lending at 25% and borrowing at 5 to 6%. Does that make sense? Does it make sense why you would want to do that? Why Biddle would want the Second Bank of the United States to be the only lender between Europe or between Britain and the United States? What's the payoff for him in that kind of environment? He borrows at say 5 to 6%, right? And a monopoly on and lends at 25%. So yeah, he borrows at 6 and he lends it up to 20 to 25%. Who gets loans? Who can do that now? Who can borrow at a low rate and lend at a high rate? What's an example of an institution that can do that? Federal Reserve, yeah, in a way it can do that. Federal Reserve actually sets its own rates. What about a company, though? Credit cards, excellent. All those credit card ads that you've been seeing. No worries, no worries. Credit cards are one of the things. So if you have credit on a credit card, as you know, the interest rate is like 25%. But the banks, American Express and Visa and MasterCard, there's just three of them. Really, I mean Discover, I suppose. But they're just a few institutions between us and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve lends now at 0.5% to American Express and to MasterCard and to Visa, to the major banks, and they lend at 25% to the rest of us with credit cards. The reason we use credit cards is because they're convenient. We know everyone will accept them, but there's a kind of monopsony, it's called. I'll spell it. Which is a sort of near monopoly that those credit card companies have. And so what Biddle is imagining is if he can lend at 20% or 25% and he can borrow at low rates, which are for him 5 to 6%, that he can make an insane amount of money, right? All he needs to do is drive out these other banks. And so what he does is issue what are called bank drafts. The Bank of the United States is simultaneously a national organization that holds, credit for the federal government. If you're a veteran of the War of 1812 or a veteran of the Revolution, and you get paid veterans benefits of any sort, the money is going to come from the Bank of the United States. If the U.S. government is going to issue bonds, those bonds are going to be issued by the Bank of the United States. So it's the sort of only bank for the United States. It's got a monopoly there, but that's not enough for Biddle. He wants a monopoly on all the credit that's going to flow from England to the U.S. So he wants to borrow on low rates from depositors at those rural and joint stock banks, at the Manchester and Liverpool banks, and he wants to lend to Americans, to slaveholders, but also not just enslavers, also small businesses in the United States, other people that need credit, ordinary businesses, manufacturing enterprises and stuff like that. But a lot of the money, a lot of the loans in the 1830s are going to people who are buying enslaved people. Does that make sense? If you can borrow at 4% or 5%, no, 5 to 6%, and you can lend at 20%, you can make an insane amount of money. And that's Biddle's plan, is to sort of drive out these banks. And he does this with the bank drafts. And the way a bank draft works is it basically is an attempt to create a single currency in the United States. So those Dixes that are issued by the agency banks, if you take that Dix, a $10 bill, into a bank in New Orleans, or to a stock exchange in New Orleans, or to a large manufacturer in New Orleans, that's worth $10 in New Orleans. But if you try to use it in New York, it's only worth $8.50 or $8.75 or $9. You have to go to a money changer to change the money, and you pay a discount. And so that makes it difficult if you're engaged in long distance trade. The $10 national currency had not been established. There was no national currency. There was just currencies from individual banks, and those individual banks were, the value of them differed quite a bit. There was a whole lot of, counterfeiting. So some of the very best notes that existed were counterfeit versions of these other notes. They'd be turned over. Inflation happens. It's sort of, I guess there's a kind of currency inflation is effectively what happens, but it's not exactly like inflation, because that $10 bill is still worth $10 in New Orleans. It's just only worth $8.50 or $8.75 in New York. If you're trading over a long distance, this is a huge pain. Does that make sense? And so these bank drafts are awesome, right? Because you take it into any branch of the Bank of the United States, and there are 30 of them, and you have a bank draft that's issued by Nicholas Biddle, and he doesn't actually sign it, but one of the other members of his bank signs it. It says it's worth $10. Any other bank in any other Bank of the United States will accept that bank draft as if it's $10. You can you see how this would work in driving away the other banks? So the other banks have to deal with the fact that they're very local and their value of their money is worth less the further away you are. But Nicholas Biddle comes up with this really interesting bank draft thing. He's not legally allowed to issue currency except for gold in his that gold and silver that the Bank of the United States has. But he creates these things called bank drafts, and he ensures that anybody who brings in a bank draft, say from New Orleans, brings it to New York, it'll be worth exactly what it says. Actually 3 before we get a national currency. It takes a while for us to get a national currency. You can imagine why there'd be opposition to a national currency, right? People in the West thinking that they're going to get sort of ripped off. People believing that, in fact, the Constitution doesn't give the government the right to issue currency. So it's not at all clear, who's going to issue it. Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great way of putting it, Lauren. He's basically establishing a franchise operation where everything is the same in every branch. And so somebody in Mississippi who is a bank manager, if they sign to say something is $10 or $20 or $30 as a bank draft, it's worth exactly that in New York or in Philadelphia or in Boston. And so it's very much like a franchise operation. And the Bank of the United States expands rapidly. And this is during Jackson's first term. So his first term is 1828 to 1832. Jackson himself is not upset about the Bank of the United States for most of his 4 years, first 4 years. In fact, some of his stronger supporters early on were in the Bank of the United States. Jackson has a okay, bear with me here for a second. So Nicholas Biddle's dream was to replace the agency banks and the 7 houses and deal exclusively with the Bank of England, which was the source of credit, using Lombard Street bills. He did this with bank drafts and other financial instruments. He hoped to become the biggest fish, the only fish in the ocean. And over the 1830s, he began to make this happen by trying to reach around the 7 houses and drive out the local banks, which he believed were badly managed, and some of them were. Critics called the second bank the Monster Bank because it threatened to devour the other banks. They also called it the whale, the only fish in the ocean. Who was the enemy of the saltwater bank? It wasn't Jackson himself. It was this group of men who were called his kitchen cabinet. So what bank was the Monster Bank? The Monster Bank, as people called it, was the second Bank of the United States under Nicholas Biddle. People feared this bank because it was going to swallow up all of the other banks across the Atlantic Ocean. The agency banks, that were down here in the United States, and the 7 houses that had previously been lending to those agency banks. Okay, so Jackson has a cabinet, and a regular cabinet, which is, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, Secretary of what else? What are the other Secretary of State? Those are the people who Martin Van Buren is kind of manages, and there are people that he agrees with sometimes and he disagrees with sometimes. But he creates this other kind of kitchen cabinet, it's called, who are the people who are going to be his advisors. And the people who know about the kind of pulse of the people, these are people who in many cases, operate newspapers. Okay, and it's these scary individuals here. Duff Green, who operated a newspaper in the in D.C., who did not like banks very much. James Watson Webb, who was the editor of the New York Courier and Inquirer. It was the biggest paper in the United States the largest circulation paper in the United States, the New York Courier and Inquirer. It doesn't exist anymore, but then in the 1830s, it was the most important newspaper in New York. And then finally, this handsome-looking devil on the right, Frank Preston Blair, who had some, I guess, some awful teeth, apparently. And those three, he does look like Gandalf a little bit. And why would you bring a staff in for, a pose photograph? But whatever. These are actually, this photo is taken around 1860, so it's like maybe 20 years after him. But he looked like, Duff Green is an interesting character, and he did look, in fact, like, I hadn't thought of, it's exactly like Gandalf. James Watson Webb with his hand in his jacket, just like Napoleon. He was the sort of Napoleon of editors, the most powerful editor probably in the country at this point. Maybe it's possible. It's possible. I think that actually the staff is very much a kind of it's a kind of symbol of the sort of he saw himself as a sort of Old Testament prophet a little bit, and he saw himself as a simple farmer. So the yellowish photo, the one in the middle, that's Jackson. Yeah. That's Jackson himself. Sorry. And that's his kitchen cabinet that surrounds him. And then Frank Preston Blair is one of the most powerful politicians in Tennessee, Missouri, and places like that. So this is his kitchen cabinet. They are his advisors, and they say it's between 1828 and 1832. They're talking about. They're talking about his future campaign. And James Watson Webb, though, had overextended himself to build his newspaper. He had invested in steamboats, which ran out to get the latest news from any ship that sailed in to the New York harbor. He had created a steam-powered press, one of the first in the country. And James Watson Webb got in trouble, financial trouble, around 1830. And he had overextended himself to build the paper, and he had many debts. He had so many debts that he decided in March of 1830, he went to Nicholas Biddle, or Nicholas Biddle went to him and offered him a very sizable loan. Duff Green and Blair had said that the way to build your campaign is to criticize the Bank of the United States. They also persuaded him that the Bank of the United States was, in fact, expanding too rapidly, trying to drive out all competitors, and trying to monopolize the trade. And so Duff Green and others who are friends with bankers, some of them in southern states, who see the power of these post notes and bank drafts in that the Bank of the United States is using, that seem to be threatening banks. Some of them are bad banks, some of them are good banks, but in any case, Nicholas Biddle is driving them out between 1828 and 1832. And so the kitchen cabinet is initially talking about, persuading Jackson that he ought to criticize the bank. But Jackson is surprised in March of 1831 when James Watson Webb changes sides. A congressional committee the next year investigates James Watson Webb and determines that, in fact, Nicholas Biddle and the Bank of the United States had bribed Webb and others, newspapers, in exchange for support. And so while Jackson had talked about the unconstitutionality of the Bank of the United States, that there was no constitutional right for there to be a monopoly in banking, James Watson Webb's newspaper criticized Jackson. James Watson Webb newspaper said, Jackson is, the greatest president ever, but he's wrong about the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States is not a horrible institution. And the next year it becomes clear that Webb had basically been bribed by the Bank of the United States. In fact, the loan from Biddle was never paid off. Webb never had to pay it off. Does that make sense? Okay. It's at this point that, bear with me here for a second, I'll jump to another. So in 1831, Jackson suggests he might not recharter the Second Bank of the United States, and Nicholas Biddle freaks out, gets very upset. And Biddle starts to publish articles supporting the bank. He gets people in Congress to support him, including Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. And at some point, Nicholas Biddle, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams meet together at the Bank of the United States and talk about the threat of Jackson, of the danger of Jackson. In 32, Jackson is going to try to veto a bill to recharter the Bank of the United States. And Nicholas Biddle is going to reprint Jackson's veto because he thinks it's so illiterate and so crazy and so ridiculous that Biddle prints tens of thousands of copies of Andrew Jackson's veto. And what happens is that Jackson's veto helps bring Jackson to power in 1832. It becomes so popular, this attack on this institution, that Jackson wins the election of 1832 by a landslide. Oh, sorry, and there's a little bit more about James Watson Webb. James Watson Webb is the person who coins the name Whigs around 1832, possibly in Biddle's office with John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. The three of them in Biddle's office come up with a new party to attack Jackson, to critique Jackson. And they use the term Whigs. Now, why would they use the term Whigs? What is the Whig? What is a Whig? What do Whigs do? It's a term for British folks. And so the Whigs in Britain were the people who opposed the power of the. Are you talking about on me or Webb? I see. Right. To hide bald spots. No, Whig, W-H-I-G, those are people who believe that the crown had too much power. And so what the Whig Party in Britain did was try to push back against the power of the king or the queen, depending on the period. And so they used the term Whig Party to suggest their opposition to King Andrew Jackson. That King Andrew Jackson, by using the veto, has expanded the power of the president. The president has become too powerful after 1832. And the people who support the Whig Party are a complicated patchwork coalition, just like the Democrats are. They include Henry Clay, who's a slaveholder. They include John Quincy Adams, who's not a slaveholder and is quite anti-slavery. It includes people who believe that Jackson's policy of removing Indians from Georgia and Alabama is unconstitutional, but it also includes people who support the Second Bank of the United States. So the Whig Party is a combination of people who are closely connected to the bank, as well as people who are abolitionists, or at least anti-slavery, alongside people who are pro-slavery, but who think that Andrew Jackson is too powerful and too dangerous. That so-called corrupt bargain that we saw before between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, in a way, cements this group that's going to call itself the Whig Party. Does that make sense? Jackson wins the election of 1832 in a landslide, but he decides, because he used a lot of vetoes. Yeah, right. He was the first president. There were a few presidents before him that used a couple of vetoes. Jackson issued like 37 vetoes. He vetoed more legislation than anybody before him. And almost everybody after him. It seems to me that there was somebody who's issued more vetoes than... I'm sure Trump has issued more vetoes. No, that's not true. In any event, I've forgotten now, but there were... in the 20th century, there were many more bills, and so obviously many more vetoes. But Jackson increased the number of vetoes like 30-fold. So... right? Okay, and I don't want to suggest that Jackson is a villain, because Jackson is, he clearly detects a conspiracy, and he's not wrong. He's not wrong that there's a conspiracy. There really is a conspiracy. James Watson Webb was in fact bribed by Nicholas Biddle to to support the Second Bank of the United States against Jackson. Ah, excellent. FDR. That's who I was thinking of. Thank you. Not since FDR. FDR was the person who issued more vetoes after Jackson, but he was the first to issue as many vetoes, and FDR was then the only person after him, I think, to issue more vetoes. Thank you, Inga. All right. And so it's at this point that Jackson goes on the warpath. And Jackson issues a few things that are about destroying the Bank of the United States, destroying the whale. And what Jackson wants to do is eliminate that credit chain that depends on Britain. Why? As Jackson sees it, Great Britain has way too much power by the interest rate. So let's think a little bit about the interest rate. If the interest rate goes up in Great Britain, what happens in this credit chain? Well, let's see. Interest rates are around 3% in deposits in rural joint stock banks. That interest rate is set by the Bank of England. And the reason it sets that interest rate is basically to make sure it has enough gold to pay for its deposits. 5% is the rate for the sterling bills of exchange. 8 to 25% is the rate in the United States. Does that make sense? So basically, these people are borrowing from these people who are borrowing from these people. And each time the interest rate goes up. Does that make sense? So if, for some reason, having nothing to do with the United States, the Great Britain increases the bank rate from 3% to 4%, what happens? Well, suddenly the seven houses get worried, and they raise the bank rate from 5% to 7%, right? Because if they're going to lend, they have to borrow at a higher rate, the rate that they're going to demand to lend is going to go up. Does that make sense? And then, so the rates on the sterling bills of exchange are going to go up. And then the Second Bank of the United States and the agency banks are forced to raise interest rates there to 12 or 13, 14%, just to be able to make sure that they can pay off those debts. So if you have a long chain of credit, each person in that line is, in a way, very closely watching what's going on at the beginning of that line. That's why the Federal Reserve brought the interest rate down to 0.5% in the United States in the last couple of years after the pandemic started. If the interest rate goes down, the cost to borrow money goes down. Even credit card rates go down slightly, but business loan rates go down. It becomes easier to borrow money, and it will juice the economy, and it will help benefit the economy. If the economy is overheating, if there's too much borrowing and lending, if people are borrowing in a kind of speculative way, if you raise the interest rate, people say, oh, I can't borrow at 25%, I can't borrow at 18%. They'll slow down their borrowing and as a result cool down the economy. So high interest rates slow down the economy, low interest rates boost the economy. The trouble with this long distance chain of credit is that when the Bank of England changes the bank rate from 3.25% to 3.25%, say, the effects are felt all the way in the United States. Okay? The U.S. is dependent, very dependent, on the Bank of England. Every day in a newspaper, we see in the 1830s and 1840s, and all the major commercial newspapers, you saw what the bank rate was. It was just called the rate. I didn't even mention it was the Bank of England's rate. The rate is 3%. The rate is 3.25%. The rate is 3.5%. And as a result, people would make a whole lot of decisions in the United States based on what the Bank of England was doing. The Bank of England's rate depended on crazy things like conflicts in India, like conflicts in China. All sorts of things affected the Bank of England's ability to lend money to be the lender of the last resort. And so this, as Jackson sees it, is dangerous. And so what he wants is to create an entirely U.S. credit system. Okay? Sounds like a good idea, maybe. It's impossible. Basically, one president can't do it. But Jackson thinks he can. Sorry. Nowadays, the loan interest rate is high. Why the economy is still boosted. So let's see. So we've got the interest rate is low in the bank rate. What's the bank rate now? Let's see. The bank rate now is 0.5%. I'm pretty sure. And the mortgage rate, that is to get a mortgage, take out a mortgage, is about 1.98%, which is about the lowest it's ever been. And as a result, there are a lot of people that are buying houses now as a result of this low interest rate. The rate on other things like, what would you call it? If you walk into a bank and get a business loan, the business loan will be a business loan will be is not the bank rate, and it's not the mortgage rate. It's the let's see, business loan rate. Sorry, I'm going to Google here. I don't know what it is. What's the? Oh, I'm not going to find it. I forget what but the business rate is around 7 or 8%. So that's partly why the economy is doing pretty well now. The economy is still boosted because interest rates are relatively low. Credit card rates, though, are a little bit different. Credit card rates are 20% or 25% or something like that. But that's in part because the expectation is that many people who have credit cards will not pay. And so built into the very high credit card rate is the expectation that defaults are going to be relatively high. Right. Yeah. So student loans are also a little bit higher, or like 8 or 9%, in part because the expectation is that some people won't pay them. They're still lower than credit cards because you can't. You have to pay that loan rate even if you're declare bankruptcy. You still have to pay for your student loans, and so that's why student loan rates are like 8 or 9%, whereas credit card rates are still 25 to 30%. That makes sense? So we're still in that world. It's just that now in the United States, it's the Federal Reserve that sets the rate, and that affects all the other rates. At this point in the 1830s, the rate that the United States had for its loans came from Britain, and Britain effectively if it changed its rates, it changed the rates for everybody all the way down. And so this is Andrew Jackson's dream. Okay, Andrew Jackson's dream is that the Treasury bills and U.S. deposits will be the primary source for lending. And so he passes some acts that are, I think, going to be discussed in the next chapter. I hope they're going to be discussed in the next chapter. He removes federal deposits from the Second Bank of the United States to the pet banks, basically by executive order. He takes all of the federal money that's deposited in the Bank of the United States, and he sends them to banks that are friendly to him politically. Does that make sense? That's December of 1833. Then in August of 1834, he passes the Coinage Act, which officially values silver lower. I don't know, Jackson is not a finance whiz. So he thinks that this Coinage Act, which officially values silver lower, is going to attract gold onto the market. For those of you that are econ majors, you know that what that effectively does is drive gold out of the market if you price silver lower than gold. But anyway, he passes the Coinage Act. He passes the Distribution Act then in June of 1836, which is to take all of the federal deposits. And the federal government at this point is not in a deficit. The federal government under Jackson is actually at a surplus. The federal government under Andrew Jackson, for the first time, is the first government in the world that basically has more money than it needs. it's collecting more from tariffs and collecting more from land that it's selling in the West and things like that than it's having to pay out for veterans benefits or what else? Any federal spending of the National Library or the Postal Service or any of those other institutions. So the federal government has a surplus, and so he takes that surplus and he distributes that among his pet banks, basically to give the Second Bank of the United States competition. And then finally in 1836, he passes a specie circular, which says that you can only buy federal land with gold or silver. Okay, that is the beginning of the Panic of 1837. Right? Remember the Panic of 1819 when the Second Bank of the United States starts to close down those other banks? That's effectively what Jackson is doing here. He doesn't like the Second Bank of the United States, but he's doing what the Second Bank of the United States, what Chivas does, which is basically to say you can't buy land unless you use silver and gold. Banknotes are not acceptable. Jackson hates the Bank of the United States. He doesn't like other banks either, but this is a ridiculously bad idea to suddenly demand that people pay silver and gold for their land. But it's designed to destroy the bank. And so this is Andrew Jackson's bank war. Bear with me here for a second. So this is a currency that's issued during 1837, a kind of fake currency. And let's see what's going on in this currency, which is designed as a joke. It issues things that are called mint drops, which are drops from the U.S. Mint. And the expectation is that these things, these gold coins, are going to be the basis of American credit. What actually happens is that people take those gold coins and they hoard them because they're sort of underpriced for what they are. So this is Jackson here on the right, and what's he doing? Yeah, he wants to close. No, he wants to support the pet banks, but he wants to defeat the Second Bank of the United States. And he's so bent on defeating the Second Bank of the United States that he, in effect, actually hurts the pet banks. Because in demanding gold and silver, even the pet banks are in trouble because now their currency can't be used to buy land from the land office. He thinks that there's a land bubble. He thinks that there is a problem. And so he's chasing after what's called the gold humbug, right? You've heard the expression gold bug. So he believes that by issuing gold that somehow there's going to be enough credit that's going to be distributed around the country that honest farmers are going to be able to buy land without that much credit because they're going to use these gold medallions to buy things. This is, it says, "Go it thou Roman, a greater man ne'er lived in the tide of times." And then this is Bart Van Buren. "Although I follow in the footsteps of Jackson, it is expedient at this time to deviate a little." And so this shin plaster, as it's called, is basically a 50-cent note, which is not going to be worth anything. It's just designed as a political cartoon to attack Andrew Jackson. Okay. And so this is what happens after the Coinage Act is passed. Remember we talked about 1819, when land prices go up and they shoot back down again. Land prices shoot up again in the 1830s under Jackson's second term. And then, shortly after Jackson passes the specie circular, land prices drop again. Okay, the sale of land. A lot of this is Indian land. Right? A lot of this is land that's expropriated land from people who are expelled by the Trail of Tears, the Creeks and the Cherokees and things like that. A lot of that land goes on the market. People buy it up. But by 1837, no one can buy land because Jackson's specie circular has made it impossible to buy land further in the West. Now, having said that, I should also say that the U.S. is not the only firm that's involved in this. And let me just give you a sense of what happens. So this is what the U.S. does, and this is mostly under Jackson, but also the Congress. The Coinage Act, which is designed to use gold and silver, gold to replace silver in notes, and then the Specie Circular. The reason is because you can't buy land because you have to pay for it in gold or silver, and no one has gold or silver. I mean, some people have gold or silver, but very few people do. And lots of farmers who have been getting credit from banks, or who have been able to buy on credit from the land office, are again hosed because they cannot get enough gold together to pay for their installments on their land. That's part of it. Part of it is that cotton prices drop 30 to 40% because of this panic. And when cotton prices drop, then enslavers or anyone else who's growing cotton can't possibly pay back their loans that are made to banks and things like that because cotton prices have dropped so much. The reason cotton prices have dropped so much is because this whole credit chain is basically whacked by Jackson. Okay, so here's what happens. The British Bank of England briefly refuses all loans to American merchants in July of 1836. Not because of the Specie Circular, but because they think that some of these banks are actually fairly corrupt. And then, in 1836, the Bank of England raises the rate, which is already relatively high at 4, to 4.5 in July of 1836. Okay, and what that does is increases the interest rates all the way down. So if you want to borrow money, even for short term, the price to borrow shoots up rapidly. It gets to 99% in New Orleans and New York by 1837. The rate to borrow money is 99%. If you want to borrow $100 for a year, you have to pay $200 a year from now to get it. So $199 a year from now to get it. So it becomes impossible to borrow money. In part because of Jackson's actions, but also because the British Bank of England's response to this, which is to say, we need to raise the bank rate. We're not going to have enough gold. The Specie Circular is going to suck gold out of Britain and bring it into the United States. We need to raise the interest rate. And what this does is close all sorts of banks all along the Mississippi River, in particular those southern banks that have been depending on this credit that comes from Britain. Does that make sense? Then the House of Commons publishes its secret investigation of joint stock banks that are invested in the U.S. cotton market. Okay? This secret investigation shows that these depositors all the way up here, people who have money in Britain who are borrowing, who are putting their money in these rural joint stock banks, rural joint stock banks, and the Manchester and Liverpool banks, they are indirectly invested in slavery, right? So that's what happens in the secret House of Commons report. A secret House of Commons investigation reports that the joint stock banks and the banks in Liverpool and Manchester are actually invested in the U.S. cotton market. And if cotton prices go down, those banks will be in serious trouble because they won't get their money back. The secret investigation is leaked to the London Times. It's then all over Great Britain by 1837. Lots of people start withdrawing their money from the Manchester and Liverpool banks, start withdrawing their deposits from the rural joint stock banks. And as a result, a number of British banks also fail, in part because people believe that that these banks are invested in slavery and invested in speculative cotton expansion, and they are. And so then the Bank of England again raises the rate to the highest rate it has ever been in the 19th century up until 1870, and that is from 4.5 to 5. And that basically is the Panic of 1837. Cotton prices drop 30 to 40%. And by January of 1838, panic moves from New Orleans to New York as the agency banks collapse from March to May of 1837. And we are in another financial panic. When the panic hit Albany in New York in May, Herman Melville was most affected by it. Herman Melville, bear with me here for a second, was a scrivener for the Bank of Albany. A scrivener for the Bank of Albany. And that means somebody who is responsible for writing and rewriting notes and debts and contracts and things like that, making perfect copies of notes and of debts and bills of exchange and things like that for the Bank of Albany. Bear with me here for a second. The New York Bank would forward notes to the Bank of the United States in exchange for credit, and the Bank of the United States did the saltwater work. It was the saltwater bank, bringing them to England where they paid off debts that Americans owed for English goods, like cotton shirting and iron rails and Sheffield scissors, manufactured by workers in the north of England. Steel and cheap clothing and scissors came back from England to America. Cotton came from America to England. The Bank of England made the entire system work by calculating credits and debits. The Bank of England set the rate, and the Bank of the United States made the entire system work by calculating credits and debits on both sides of the Atlantic. The agency banks also did this. When the panic hit Albany in May, Herman Melville's mother was forced to make a bond of $50,000 to cover the debts of Andrew Jackson's uncle, Gansvoort. Sorry, I'll spell that. Gansvoort is a Dutch name. It means duck path. Gansvoort had been the kind of family, had manages the finances of the family, and Melville's family was quite rich at the time. But his mother had to make a bond for Gansvoort because he lost everything. Herman's uncle, Gansvoort, other uncle, also bankrupted, ran off to Illinois, abandoning the family estate in the Berkshires. The Melvilles lost everything in the Panic of 1837. Now jobless, Herman returned to the estate while the family scrambled to pay the back taxes on it. Wandering around the old mansion, examining the peeling wallpaper and the family papers, he reflected on the fate of his once proud and wealthy family, humbled by the Panic of 1837. After working for a few years as a tutor, he left New York for a life at sea in 1841. Years later, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 1850, 1851, an older Herman Melville reflected on the course of his life with an allegorical story. He called it The Whale. It was a story of Ishmael, a simple sailor from an old established family, someone very much like himself, who signs on board a whaling ship led by the crazy Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab was a driven man with a long scar on his face. The captain's scar is the source of Ahab's rage, much like the scar that Andrew Jackson received from an English officer in his youth. Among the Democratic crew that works for Ahab and the bankers and the Bank of Albany who had initially supported Jackson, few fully understood his reckless plan to destroy the second bank. I'll quote Moby Dick, "Had any of his old acquaintances on shore but half dreamed of what was lurking in him then, how soon would their aghast and righteous souls have wrenched the ship from such a fiendish man." The ship owners, like the Albany party that supported Jackson at first, under Martin Van Buren, had brought Jackson to power. They were, quote, bent on profitable cruises, the profit to be counted down in dollars from the mint. But Ishmael is learning that crazy Ahab seeks audacious, immitigable, and supernatural revenge. Ahab's enemy is a whale, a murderous monster that seems to be everywhere and nowhere. The Saltwater Bank of the United States provided credit for trade across the Atlantic, but while, quote, the accountants have computed their great counting house, the globe, by girdling it with guineas, my vengeance will fetch a great premium here, says Ahab. pounding his chest. Ahab's rage is likewise boundless, for he, quote, piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all his general rage and hate felt by his whole race. In the novel, Ahab nails a gold piece worth 16 silver dollars to the mast, an echo of Jackson's specie circular that sought to nail trade to a new form of currency. The man who helps Ahab kill the white whale, Ahab says, will receive it. And so the war between Ahab and this monster, this Leviathan, comes to matter more than anything. As the older Melville knew, the battle between captain and monster in 1837 would soon consume them all. In 1832 would soon consume them all by 1836 and 37, driving captain, crew, and whale into oblivion. For while the Bank War of 1832 to 1837 helped consolidate Jackson's political power, it helped ensure Martin Van Buren's election afterwards. The depression that followed Van Buren's inauguration in 1837 tore the country apart. The Democratic Party, like Ahab's ship, would be shattered in the Panic of 1837. For Jackson, the ill that the Bank of the United States did was to corrupt Washington itself. And he was absolutely right about that. To corrupt his own political allies, like James Washington Webb, and lead them to move against him. While the credit could buy loyalty and corrupt a democracy, the credit could also be organized in a way that was calculated to make labor cheap. The asset that bankers in the north of England sought was cheap raw cotton. The cheaper the better, because cheap cotton goods provided a passport for Britain into every international port in the world. These cheap cotton goods made it possible for England to become an international empire. But that cotton depended on enslaved people in the American South. Why was cotton cheap? Because the credit of the saltwater banks went directly to Southern planters who owned human beings. These human beings could be driven west to the most productive landscape in the Americas, the Black Belt. The credit allowed the expropriation of the Native Americans there and the creation of a punitive labor system that rewarded force. And it is here that Andrew Jackson's war against the bank, like Ahab's war against the whale, may be most surprising. Which side should we choose? The monster bank or Jackson, the president and slaveholder, right? The monster bank is the one that makes it possible for this rapid expansion in the Southwest by offering credit. Andrew Jackson is a slaveholder, but he's opposed to the Bank of the United States. It's hard to find somebody to love on either side of this war. I'd like to suggest that despite our tendency to dislike Jackson and take him off the $20 bill, Jackson's war may have been the best thing that ever happened to the American South over the long term. Why? Because credit to the American South dried up rapidly after the Panic of 1837. No comparable institution emerged to provide easy credit to slaveholders. Most planters after 1837 had to borrow from each other, which made it harder and harder for enslavers to move west into Texas and the Mississippi. A new credit bridge from America to England came only later in 1851, and that was through land grants, and we'll talk about that later, land grants and railroads. The western railroads into Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri acted like mortgage banks, and would be a new kind of credit chain would be created. This credit chain based on railroads is going to expand the Northwest rather than the Southwest. 180 years after the Bank War, the American South and the Southern labor have still not recovered from the system that established the whale of Lombard Street, the second bank of the United States, which helped build the British Empire using the forced labor of 10 million black bodies. Jackson's fatal blow to that credit system in 1837 finally ensured that English credit would no longer populate the American Southwest with a system of forced labor. Andrew Jackson destroyed the bank, much against his own interest as a slaveholder and as a planter. And so here we can understand the war and Herman Melville. Though we live in a South with relatively weak public schools, a Jim Crow legal system, it's inarguably better than the system of forced slave labor that broke many of the swampy plains of Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas in the 1830s. As historians We're all of us devoted to understanding that legacy, still finding the pieces of driftwood from the 1837 battle between massed credit in the Second Bank of the United States and the devoted followers of Ahab, the Democratic Party that went down with the ship. Are there questions? I think so. Let me pull it up. Look at the syllabus here. No, it's we'll be on chapter 11. Chapter 10 was this last week, the week that started the 23rd, and next week will be chapter 11. And where you'll read a very different interpretation of Jackson and the Bank War. Other questions? It's a good question. There's so one strain of thinking in the Democratic Party has been that Jackson actually wanted a Federal Reserve, that he actually wanted a federal government control over credit rather than a private bank like the Second Bank of the United States. And so some people believe that even though Jackson hated the Second Bank of the United States, that he actually would have liked a Federal Reserve where basically a more or less state entity is in control of credit. Infamous. Did I say that? Infamous. Other questions? It's possible. It's possible. It's clear that I'm pretty sure he would have disliked having been put on paper money. I'm actually not suggesting that we keep him on paper money. I just think that Jackson is, I think, somewhat misunderstood because he hated the Second Bank of the United States and he was a slaveholder. But in a way, his own actions helped destroy the credit that allowed the rapid expansion into the Southwest.